"I thought you'd finally feel lighter without that old piano taking up space," my daughter-in-law said while sipping coffee in my kitchen, as if she were talking about an outdated lamp instead of the last piece of my mother I still had left in this world. I stood frozen in the doorway of my living room, staring at the empty corner beside the window where the antique baby grand piano had sat for more than 40 years. The sunlight still touched the hardwood floor the same way it always had every morning, but now there was only a pale rectangle where the piano once stood, a ghostly outline pressed into the wood like a scar. For a moment I honestly thought I was confused. At 68, you start questioning your own memory before you question the people you love. I blinked twice and looked around the room again, expecting to see it somehow tucked into another corner, but the space remained painfully empty. My chest tightened slowly, not sharply, just enough to make breathing feel unfamiliar. "Where is it?" I asked quietly. Vanessa didn't even look guilty. She leaned casually against the marble kitchen island, with her perfectly manicured nails wrapped around a white ceramic mug that had once belonged to my mother too. "I sold it this morning," she said. "A designer from Boston bought it for a staging project." Honestly, Margaret, it was collecting dust. Collecting dust. Those words settled over me heavier than I expected. My mother, Evelyn Carter, used to play that piano every Sunday evening while the smell of pot roast drifted through the house. Chopin on rainy nights. Gershwin at Christmas. Sometimes old church hymns when life became too difficult for words. After she passed away 12 years ago, I couldn't bring myself to move the piano even an inch. I kept the bench exactly where she left it. There were still tiny scratches near the keys from my son Daniel's toy trucks back when he was 5 years old. That piano had heard every version of our family. The happy years, the quiet years, the grieving years, and now it was simply gone. "You sold it," I repeated. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. Vanessa sighed softly, the way people do when they think they're being patient with someone unreasonable. "Margaret, you never even played it anymore. The house needed a cleaner look." Besides, Daniel agreed. That part hurt more than I expected. I looked toward the dining room where my son sat staring down at his phone, pretending not to hear us. He didn't look up once. Not once. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly past the house, and for one strange second I imagined chasing it down the street, hoping somehow my mother's piano was still inside. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't really about furniture. Vanessa hadn't just removed a piano from my home. She had removed proof that my family existed before she arrived. And standing there in that unbearable silence, I realized something even worse. Everyone in the house had known it was happening except me. That evening, the house felt wrong in ways I could not fully explain. Not louder. Not quieter. Just hollow, as if something living had been removed from its center. I stayed in the living room long after Daniel and Vanessa disappeared upstairs, sitting alone in the armchair beside the empty space where the piano had stood for most of my adult life. The lamp beside me cast a warm yellow light across the hardwood floor, and every few minutes my eyes drifted back to that pale rectangle in the wood where the sunlight had not touched in decades. Dust floated lazily through the air. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh paint from the kitchen remodel Vanessa had insisted on last spring. Everything looked cleaner now. Colder too. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself even though it was nearly 70 degrees outside. My mother used to say a house could sense grief before people did. Back then I thought she was being poetic. Sitting there alone, I was not so sure anymore. I could still hear the piano if I closed my eyes. Not perfectly. Memory never works perfectly at my age. But pieces remained. Certain notes. Certain pauses. The soft creak of the bench whenever my mother leaned forward to reach lower keys. She played every Sunday night after dinner without fail. My father would read the newspaper in his recliner pretending not to listen, but sometimes I caught him smiling behind the pages. When Daniel was little, he used to crawl beneath the piano during thunderstorms because he said Grandma Evelyn's music made the house feel safe. I remember one Christmas Eve when the power went out during a snowstorm and the entire neighborhood went dark. My mother lit candles all through the house and played Silent Night while Daniel sat curled beside her under a wool blanket. He could not have been older than 6. That memory came back so clearly it almost stole the breath from my lungs. And now somehow that same little boy had allowed strangers to carry the piano away like it meant nothing at all. Around 9 o'clock I finally stood and walked slowly across the room. My knees ached the way they always did before rain. I reached the empty corner and rested my hand against the wall beside the window. The silence there felt unnatural. I noticed tiny marks on the baseboard where the piano pedals had brushed against the wood over the years. Small scratches. Faded dents. Proof that something beautiful had once existed there long enough to leave scars behind. My eyes burned suddenly, but I refused to cry. Vanessa would not understand tears like that anyway. To her, old things were problems waiting to be replaced. Sentimental clutter. Obstacles to modern furniture and open space. She did not understand that some objects carried entire lifetimes inside them. I turned off the lamp and started toward the stairs when I noticed something sitting alone near the fireplace. A single sheet of yellowed paper, folded once down the middle. My heart tightened immediately because I recognized my mother's handwriting before I even picked it up. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper beneath the dim light near the staircase. The handwriting was unmistakable. Elegant loops. Delicate pressure marks where my mother always pressed too hard with fountain pens. For a moment, I forgot about the empty room behind me. Forgot about Vanessa upstairs and Daniel pretending nothing had happened. All I saw was my mother sitting beside the dining room window years ago with her reading glasses low on her nose, writing grocery lists and birthday cards in the same careful script. The paper itself looked old, yellowed at the edges and soft from age. I stared at the folded crease for several seconds before finally reading the first line. For Margaret, when the music finally stops. My breath caught so suddenly I had to grip the staircase railing beside me. I had never seen the letter before in my life. Slowly, I lowered myself onto the bottom stair and continued reading. The note was short, no more than 1 page, but every sentence felt heavier than the last. My mother wrote about memory, about family, about how certain objects carried pieces of people long after they were gone. She said the piano was never truly furniture to her. It was history. It was proof that joy had once lived in our family even during the hardest years. Then came the sentence that made my stomach tighten. There is something inside the piano that belongs only to you, Margaret. Someday you will understand why I could not tell anyone else. I read that line 3 times. Inside the piano. My eyes moved quickly across the rest of the letter searching for explanation, but there was nothing more specific. Only one final sentence written smaller than the others near the bottom of the page. Do not let strangers decide what is worth keeping. Upstairs, I heard footsteps crossing the hallway floor followed by Vanessa laughing softly at something on television. The sound drifted down casually, carelessly, while I sat there holding what felt like the final conversation I would ever have with my mother. A strange feeling settled over me then. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Clearer. I thought back over the past few years and suddenly small moments began fitting together differently inside my head. Vanessa slowly replacing family photographs with abstract prints. The old quilt from my grandmother disappearing after she called it outdated. My mother's china boxed up in the basement because it did not match the kitchen aesthetic. At the time, I convinced myself these were normal changes young couples made when building a home together. But sitting there with my mother's letter in my hands, I realized something painful. Vanessa had never been trying to join this family. She had been redesigning it, piece by piece, memory by memory, until nothing remained that existed before her. I folded the paper carefully and held it against my chest. Somewhere out there, strangers now owned my mother's piano. And hidden inside it was something she had spent years protecting for me. Something important enough that she trusted the piano more than people. I looked toward the dark living room one more time before slowly standing. Then for the first time since the piano disappeared, I stopped feeling helpless. Because if my mother hid something inside that instrument, then I intended to find it before Vanessa realized what she had really sold. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always did after difficult nights. The house was still dark and quiet, wrapped in that strange blue-gray light that comes just before dawn. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot everything. Then I walked downstairs and saw the empty corner again. The feeling returned immediately. Heavy. Permanent. I made coffee slowly, listening to the soft drip of the machine while rain tapped gently against the kitchen windows. Vanessa hated rainy mornings. She said they made the house feel depressing. My mother used to love them because they made music sound warmer. I carried my mug into the dining room and unfolded the letter again beneath the chandelier light. I read every word carefully this time, searching for clues hidden between the sentences. There is something inside the piano that belongs only to you. The line repeated itself in my head over and over. Around 7 o'clock, I heard Vanessa come downstairs wearing expensive running clothes and carrying her phone in one hand. She stopped briefly when she saw me sitting there with the letter. "You are up early," she said casually. "Could not sleep," I replied. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out almond milk without asking whether anyone else wanted coffee. Little things reveal people over time. It is never the grand gestures. It is the tiny assumptions. The belief that everything belongs to them eventually. Vanessa leaned against the counter scrolling through her phone, while speaking without looking at me. "The designer already transferred the payment yesterday. Honestly, Margaret, the room looks so much brighter now." I folded the letter carefully before answering. "Who bought it?" That finally made her pause. "Only for a second. Some restoration company outside Boston, I think. I do not remember the name." She said it too quickly. I noticed that immediately. Vanessa always remembered names when money was involved. Before I could respond, Daniel walked in wearing his office clothes with his tie hanging loose around his neck. He looked tired, older somehow. He poured himself coffee quietly and avoided eye contact the same way he had the night before. Watching him stand there brought back another memory so suddenly it almost hurt. He was 8 years old, sitting beside my mother at the piano bench while she guided his hands across the keys. He used to laugh every time he hit the wrong note because she would pretend the piano was arguing with him. "The piano is stubborn today," she would say. Daniel loved that instrument once. Loved it enough to polish the wood for her after school. I wondered when exactly love became convenience in this house. "Did you know there was something hidden inside it?" I asked softly. Daniel frowned. "Inside what?" "The piano." His expression changed slightly then. Confused first, then cautious. Vanessa answered before he could speak. "What would be hidden inside a piano?" she said with a small laugh. "Maybe old sheet music." But Daniel looked directly at me for the first time since all of this began. And in that brief moment, I realized something important. He truly did not know about the letter, which meant Vanessa had acted alone. She finished her coffee, grabbed her car keys, and headed toward the garage without another word. A few seconds later, I heard the engine start outside. Daniel stood silently near the counter staring into his mug. Then quietly, almost too quietly to hear, he asked, "Mom, what exactly did Grandma leave inside that piano?" For the rest of the morning, Daniel moved through the kitchen like a man trying to avoid stepping on broken glass. He kept opening cabinets without taking anything out, checking his watch, glancing toward the garage every time a car passed outside. I sat quietly at the dining room table with my coffee growing cold beside me, and my mother's letter folded neatly in my lap. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the candle Vanessa always burned this time of year, though suddenly even that scent felt artificial to me. Daniel finally sat across from me around 8:30, loosening his tie before work the way he always did when something weighed heavily on his mind. "Mom," he said carefully, "why would Grandma hide something inside the piano instead of just giving it to you directly?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. At 39, my son still had the same blue eyes he did as a little boy, but somewhere along the years he had learned how to look away whenever honesty became uncomfortable. "Because your grandmother understood people better than most," I said softly. "And because sometimes family changes after money enters the room." Daniel frowned slightly at that. "You think this is about money?" I almost laughed, though nothing about this situation felt funny anymore. "I think your wife sold something that never belonged to her." Silence settled heavily between us. Daniel rubbed one hand over his jaw and stared down at the table. "Vanessa thought she was helping," he muttered eventually. "She said you never used it anymore. She said the house felt crowded." Crowded? I looked around the dining room slowly. The room held 6 chairs, a china cabinet, and 30 years of birthdays, Christmas dinners, arguments, reconciliations, and late-night conversations. Young people always confuse emptiness with cleanliness. They remove history and call it simplicity. "Did she ask me first?" I asked calmly. Daniel did not answer. That silence told me enough. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel finally left for work after kissing the top of my head distractedly on his way out the door. It reminded me painfully of childhood habits he no longer realized he still carried. Once the house became quiet again, I unfolded the letter for what must have been the 10th time that morning. This time I noticed something I had missed before. At the bottom corner beneath my mother's signature was a small set of numbers written lightly in pencil. 5-1-1-8. At first they meant nothing to me. Then suddenly my heart skipped. Combination numbers. My mother used combinations instead of labels for everything important. The old cedar chest in her attic. Her safety deposit box at Hartford Savings. Even the lock she once kept on her recipe cabinet. I stared at the numbers until a memory surfaced slowly through the fog of years. Inside the piano bench there had always been a tiny locked compartment beneath the velvet lining, where my mother stored tuning tools and sheet music. I had forgotten about it completely. My hands tightened around the paper. Whatever my mother hid might still be there if nobody had checked carefully before moving the piano. At that exact moment my phone rang unexpectedly beside my coffee cup. The caller ID showed a Massachusetts area code I did not recognize. I hesitated before answering. Then a calm older man's voice said something that made every hair on my arms stand up. "Mrs. Whitmore? My name is Arthur Bellamy. I believe your mother left something important inside the piano we just received." For a second I could not speak. I sat frozen at the dining room table gripping the edge of my coffee cup while rain streaked softly down the windows behind me. The voice on the phone sounded calm and professional, but underneath it I sensed hesitation, the kind people use when they know they have stepped into a family matter bigger than they expected. "I am sorry," I finally managed. "Who did you say you were?" "Arthur Bellamy," the man repeated gently. "I own Bellamy Piano Restoration outside Worcester. We received an antique baby grand yesterday morning from a staging company in Connecticut. While inspecting the instrument, one of my technicians discovered a hidden compartment beneath the bench lining. My heart began beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I glanced instinctively toward the empty living room again as though the piano might somehow reappear if I looked quickly enough. There was an envelope inside. Arthur continued. "And several documents. Everything appears quite old. Your name was written clearly on the outside, Mrs. Whitmore." I closed my eyes briefly. My mother knew. Somehow, years ago, she had already anticipated this exact moment. "Did you open it?" I asked quietly. "No, ma'am," he answered immediately. "Not beyond enough to identify the owner. We are a restoration business, not treasure hunters." The kindness in his voice nearly broke something inside me. After 24 hours of feeling erased inside my own home, hearing a stranger treat my mother's belongings with more respect than my own family had shown felt almost unbearable. Arthur explained that he found my phone number through old paperwork tucked inside the envelope. My mother had apparently updated contact information several years earlier and hidden it alongside the documents. Even now, she had protected me more carefully than the people living under my roof. "There is also a handwritten music composition inside," he added carefully, "and what looks like property records. I thought you should know before we proceeded with any restoration work." Property records. My stomach tightened instantly. My mother owned 70 acres of undeveloped land in Vermont before she passed away, property that everyone assumed had been sold years earlier to pay medical expenses. But my mother rarely explained her finances fully to anyone, including me. "Can I come retrieve everything?" I asked. "Of course," Arthur said kindly. "Honestly, Mrs. Whitmore, I believe your mother intended for these things to remain with family." Family. The word echoed strangely in my chest after everything that had happened. We arranged for me to visit Massachusetts the following morning. It was nearly a 2-hour drive from Hartford, but suddenly distance felt irrelevant. After ending the call, I remained motionless at the table staring at the rain outside. My reflection looked older in the dark window than it had even a week earlier. Tired eyes. Silver hair falling loose around my shoulders. A woman slowly discovering she had misunderstood her own household. Around noon, Vanessa returned home carrying shopping bags and smelling faintly of expensive perfume and coffee. She walked directly through the front door, smiling at something on her phone before noticing me sitting quietly at the table. "You are still thinking about that piano?" she asked lightly. "Margaret, you really have to stop dwelling on old things." I looked at her calmly then. Really looked at her. The polished hair. The perfect makeup. The easy confidence of someone who had never once imagined consequences. And for the first time since the piano disappeared, I noticed something else too. Vanessa was not cruel because she hated me. She simply believed history belonged to whoever controlled the house now. She thought the past could be boxed up, sold, and forgotten. What she did not understand yet was that my mother had spent years preparing for exactly someone like her. That night, I packed a small overnight bag after everyone went upstairs. Just enough for one day. A navy sweater, my medication organizer, a change of clothes, and my mother's letter folded carefully inside the side pocket of my purse. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak old homes make after midnight. I moved slowly through the kitchen, turning off lights one by one, and for the first time in years, I realized I no longer felt comfortable inside my own home after dark. Not afraid exactly, just unwelcome. Around 11:30, I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me. Daniel appeared in the hallway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom?" he asked quietly. "Why are you packing?" I hesitated before answering. "I am driving to Massachusetts tomorrow morning." He frowned immediately. "For what?" I studied my son carefully in the dim kitchen light. He looked exhausted lately, the lines around his eyes deeper than they used to be. Marriage changes people in ways mothers notice before anyone else does. "The man who bought the piano found something Grandma left for me," I said softly. Daniel straightened instantly. "What kind of something?" "I do not know yet." That part was true. But I also knew enough not to tell him everything before I understood the situation fully myself. He leaned against the counter silently for a moment before speaking again. "Vanessa did not mean to hurt you." The sentence settled heavily between us. I almost smiled at how often people say those words after damage is already done. "Intentions do not return what was taken," I replied gently. Daniel lowered his eyes. For a second he looked 16 again instead of 39. Guilty. Confused. Desperate to avoid conflict. "She thought she was helping modernize the house," he muttered. "She said Grandma's things made everything feel stuck in the past." I glanced toward the dark living room where the empty corner remained hidden in shadows. "Your grandmother built this family during years when we barely had enough money for groceries," I said quietly. "That piano survived layoffs, hospital bills, winters without proper heat, and every holiday your grandfather worked double shifts just to keep this house. People who have never struggled think old things are clutter, because they have never needed memory to survive hard times." Daniel did not answer immediately. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows again. Finally, he spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "I should have asked you before letting her sell it." There it was at last. Not a defense. Not an excuse. Just truth. I nodded once. "Yes. You should have." He looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he simply wished me a safe drive and headed back upstairs. I stood alone in the kitchen for several minutes after he disappeared. Then I noticed something strange sitting near the trash can beside the pantry. A crumpled receipt partially sticking out beneath paper towels and grocery packaging. Normally I would have ignored it, but something about the restoration company logo printed across the top caught my eye immediately. Bellamy Piano Restoration. My pulse quickened as I unfolded the paper carefully. Vanessa had not sold the piano through a staging company in Connecticut. She had personally contacted the restoration business in Massachusetts 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. Long before she ever mentioned wanting more space in the living room, which meant this had never been impulsive at all. She had been planning it quietly while smiling. Through family dinners and promising she cared about preserving memories. I left before sunrise the next morning while the house was still asleep. The air outside smelled fresh from last night's rain, and a thin layer of fog hovered above the quiet Hartford streets as I backed my old Lexus out of the driveway. For years I had spent my mornings making coffee for everyone else, packing lunches, remembering birthdays, keeping routines alive inside that house. Driving away alone at 6 in the morning felt strangely unfamiliar, almost rebellious. My mother's letter rested inside my purse on the passenger seat beside me, and every few miles I found myself glancing toward it as though it might disappear too. The highway north was nearly empty. Gray clouds stretched low across the sky while soft instrumental music played quietly through the speakers. About an hour into the drive, I passed a small roadside diner where my husband used to stop during family road trips years ago. Daniel loved their blueberry pancakes when he was little. The memory arrived so suddenly it made my chest ache. There had been a time when family felt simple. Before careers and marriages and modern kitchens and silent betrayals. Back when happiness looked like paper maps, warm coffee in styrofoam cups, and my mother humming softly beside the car window. Around 8:30 my phone rang through the car speakers. Vanessa. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Margaret, she said immediately, her voice too bright, too casual. Daniel told me you drove to Massachusetts this morning. You really should have said something. I kept my eyes on the road. I did not realize I needed permission. Silence flickered briefly between us. Then came the soft laugh she always used when trying to smooth tension without admitting fault. I just think everyone is getting a little emotional over an old piano. There it was again. Old piano. As though repeating those words enough times could reduce my mother's entire life into furniture. You contacted the restoration company 3 weeks ago, I said calmly. The silence that followed lasted longer this time. I could practically hear her mind. Adjusting. Recalculating. I do not know what you mean, she replied carefully. I found the receipt last night. Another silence. Colder now. Then finally Vanessa sighed softly. Margaret, I was trying to surprise everyone. The piano needed expensive repairs anyway. I thought maybe restoring it first would make it easier for the house to feel updated without hurting your feelings. Her explanation sounded polished. Practiced even. But something about it rang hollow. So your plan was to secretly remove it from my home? I asked quietly. That sounds dramatic. Dramatic. Funny how people always use that word when they want older women to stop noticing things. I tightened my hands slightly on the steering wheel. Arthur Bellamy called me yesterday, I said. He found what my mother left inside the bench compartment. This time Vanessa stopped breathing for just a fraction too long. It was subtle. Most people would not have noticed. But mothers spend decades listening for tiny changes in silence. There was a compartment, she asked finally. And in that moment I knew two things at once. First, Vanessa truly had not known about what was hidden inside the piano. Second, whatever my mother left behind was important enough that even the possibility of it unsettled her immediately. Yes, I answered softly. There was. Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. Outside my windshield, a road sign appeared announcing Worcester 22 miles ahead. Then Vanessa said something that made the hairs rise slowly along my arms. Margaret, when you see whatever is inside, I think you should remember that some family matters are better left in the past. I arrived at Bellamy Piano Restoration just after 9 in the morning. The building sat on a quiet side road outside Worcester surrounded by tall maple trees already beginning to hint at autumn colors, even though summer had not fully ended yet. It was not the kind of flashy showroom Vanessa would have chosen. No glass walls or modern furniture. Just an old brick warehouse with polished brass lettering near the entrance and flower boxes beneath the windows. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Wood polish. Dust. Old paper. Music. It smelled exactly like memory. A tall gray-haired man in a navy sweater approached me almost immediately with kind eyes and careful manners that reminded me of another generation. Mrs. Whitmore? He asked gently. I nodded. Arthur Bellamy. He shook my hand softly, the way people do when they sense grief sitting close beneath the surface. Thank you for coming all this way. He led me through a large restoration room where half-finished pianos stood beneath warm hanging lights like patients waiting quietly for surgery. Some were missing keys. Others had their wooden frames partially dismantled. Yet every instrument still felt respected somehow. Preserved. Nothing like the disposable attitude I had grown used to back home. Then I saw it. My mother's piano stood near the far wall beneath a tall window, polished but unmistakably familiar. For a second I forgot how to breathe. The curve of the wood. The ivory keys slightly yellowed with age. The tiny scratch near the pedal from when Daniel crashed his toy firetruck into it at age 5. I walked toward it slowly as if approaching someone I had once loved deeply and almost lost forever. My fingertips brushed lightly across the polished surface. Cold wood. Familiar shape. 40 years of my life sitting silently beneath my hand. We have not begun full restoration yet, Arthur explained quietly behind me. Once we discovered the compartment, I thought it best to wait. He handed me a large cream-colored envelope tied carefully with faded blue ribbon. My mother's handwriting covered the front in elegant script. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore. Private. My eyes burned immediately. Arthur stepped away respectfully while I sat down on the old piano bench and untied the ribbon with trembling fingers. Inside were several documents, a folded handwritten music composition, and an old photograph I had never seen before. The photograph showed my mother standing beside another woman outside a small cabin somewhere in the mountains. Both were smiling at the camera while holding sheet music against the wind. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, Evelyn and Clara. Vermont. Summer. 1972. Beneath the photograph sat a thick stack of legal papers stamped with county seals from Vermont. Property records. My pulse quickened as I unfolded the first page carefully. Then the room around me seemed to tilt slightly. The 70 acres everyone believed had been sold decades ago had never been sold at all. The land still existed under a private family trust created by my mother 31 years earlier. And according to the documents resting in my shaking hands, I was the sole beneficiary. I stared at the papers in silence while rain tapped softly against the warehouse windows outside. Then I noticed one final envelope tucked beneath the others with a sentence written across the front in my mother's handwriting. If Vanessa ever tries to erase this family, read this first. I did not open the final envelope immediately. Instead, I sat there on the piano bench holding it in both hands while afternoon light stretched quietly across the restoration room floor. My mother's handwriting looked steadier on this envelope than on the others, almost deliberate in a way that unsettled me. Arthur remained respectfully across the room pretending to organize paperwork while giving me privacy. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the windows fogged softly with moisture. I ran my thumb carefully across my name written on the front of the envelope and suddenly remembered the last real conversation my mother and I ever had before her health declined. We had been sitting beside this very piano late one November evening, while she played old jazz standards with aching fingers slowed by arthritis. She looked at me out of nowhere and said, "Margaret, some people enter families looking for love. Others enter looking for ownership." At the time, I thought she was talking about distant relatives fighting over inheritances after funerals. I never imagined she already meant Vanessa. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded neatly into thirds. No legal documents. No maps. Just my mother's words. I recognized immediately that this letter had been written much later than the others because the handwriting trembled slightly near the edges. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you are reading this, then the piano has already been moved by someone who never understood why I protected it so carefully." My chest tightened instantly. I continued reading while the room around me disappeared piece by piece. My mother explained that years earlier, shortly after Daniel married Vanessa, she quietly transferred the Vermont property into a protected trust after overhearing a conversation she was never meant to hear. Vanessa had apparently asked Daniel one evening how much the land would eventually be worth if developed into vacation homes. My mother wrote that the question itself did not bother her nearly as much as the way Vanessa laughed afterward while calling family heirlooms dead weight from dead people. I stopped reading for a moment and closed my eyes. Even now, years after my mother passed away, the thought of her hearing those words alone and saying nothing about it broke my heart in ways I could not explain. The letter continued. My mother wrote that she intentionally hid the trust paperwork because she feared future pressure on Daniel to sell everything tied to family history once she was gone. "Your son has a good heart," she wrote carefully, "but weak people often mistake peace for loyalty. Vanessa understands this." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Weak people mistake peace for loyalty. It described Daniel so perfectly it almost hurt to breathe. Then came the final paragraph. "Margaret, if this family survives, it will not be because someone protected the house. It will be because someone protected the memory of who we were before greed entered the room. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the letter closed. Across the room, Arthur approached quietly holding a small velvet pouch. There was one more thing hidden beneath the compartment lining, he said softly. He placed the pouch carefully into my hand. Inside rested a delicate silver key no larger than my thumb. Attached to it was a faded tag with only 4 handwritten words. Lake House, North Vermont. I looked up slowly at Arthur while my pulse began rising all over again, because suddenly I understood something terrifying. My mother had not only hidden land from Vanessa, she had hidden an entire second property none of us knew existed. I drove back to Hartford long after sunset with the silver key resting inside my coat pocket, and my mother's letter secured carefully inside my purse beside me. The roads were dark and nearly empty, but my mind refused to settle. Every mile seemed to rearrange the story I thought I understood about my family. By the time I pulled into the driveway close to 10 o'clock, the kitchen lights were still on inside the house. Through the window, I could see Vanessa pacing near the island while Daniel sat motionless at the table with both hands clasped tightly together. The moment I stepped through the front door, the tension inside the room wrapped around me immediately. Vanessa turned first. "You ignored my calls all day," she said sharply. "No concern. No apology. Just irritation." I set my purse quietly on the hallway table and removed my coat slowly, suddenly aware of how calm I felt compared to 24 hours earlier. "I was busy," I replied. Daniel stood immediately. "Mom, we need to talk." I looked at my son carefully. His eyes were red around the edges like he had not slept properly. Vanessa folded her arms across her chest beside him, polished and defensive as always. "I think there has been a misunderstanding about the piano," she said quickly before Daniel could continue. "Arthur Bellamy called here this afternoon after realizing there were personal items inside. Obviously, if I had known that." "You planned the sale 3 weeks ago," I interrupted softly. The room fell silent. Vanessa blinked once. "What?" "I found your receipt." Her expression shifted almost invisibly. "Not guilt exactly. Calculation. I was trying to surprise everyone with a restoration," she replied carefully. "You are twisting this into something personal." I studied her quietly for several seconds before answering. "It became personal the moment you decided family history belonged to you." Daniel looked between us uneasily. "Mom," he said slowly, "what exactly did Grandma leave inside the piano?" I walked into the dining room without answering immediately and placed the trust documents gently onto the table beneath the chandelier light. Neither of them moved at first. Then Daniel stepped forward and stared down at the papers in confusion, while Vanessa's face lost color almost instantly. She recognized legal documents the same way other people recognize danger. "The Vermont property still exists," I said calmly. "My mother never sold it." Daniel looked stunned. "That is impossible." "Apparently not." Vanessa picked up one of the papers with careful fingers, scanning the pages too quickly. I watched her eyes stop suddenly near the trust beneficiary section. Then she looked up at me. "You inherited all of it?" There it was. Not surprised that my mother hid land. Not curiosity about why. Just immediate focus on ownership. My mother had understood her perfectly. "The trust cannot be altered or sold without my consent," I said quietly. Daniel sat down heavily in the nearest chair as though the floor beneath him had shifted. Vanessa, however, remained standing, gripping the papers tightly enough to wrinkle the corners. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "Your mother hid property from her own family." "No," I answered softly. "She protected it from people who viewed family as inventory." The silence after that felt enormous. Then Daniel looked at Vanessa slowly, almost like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. "Did you know about this land?" he asked quietly. Vanessa stared back at him without answering. And in that terrible silence, my son finally understood something I had realized days ago. His wife had never been trying to preserve this family. She had been measuring what was left of it. The house changed after that night, though not in loud dramatic ways. Real change inside families rarely arrives with shouting. It arrives through silence. Through doors closing softly. Through people no longer pretending not to notice what has already broken. Vanessa stopped speaking to me unless absolutely necessary. Daniel, on the other hand, began lingering in rooms after conversations ended as though he no longer trusted what happened when he looked away. 3 days later, Arthur Bellamy personally delivered the piano back to Hartford after I insisted on paying for the restoration myself. I watched from the front porch while 2 careful movers guided it slowly through the front doorway beneath the afternoon sunlight. The moment the wheels crossed into the living room again, something inside the house seemed to settle back into place. Even the air felt warmer somehow. Vanessa stood frozen near the kitchen entrance watching silently while the piano returned to the exact spot she had emptied so confidently less than a week earlier. Daniel helped position the bench beneath the keys without speaking. Once the movers left, the room became quiet except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I walked slowly toward the piano and rested my fingertips against the polished wood. Restored. Returned. Protected. My mother would have liked that. "Mom," Daniel said quietly behind me. I turned. He looked exhausted in a way sleep could not fix. "I talked to a lawyer this morning," he admitted carefully. Vanessa stiffened instantly across the room. "Daniel," she warned softly. But he did not look at her this time. He looked at me. "The Vermont Trust was never supposed to be discovered through something like this," he continued. "Grandma must have spent years trying to protect everything from falling apart." I said nothing. Some truths arrived too late for easy comfort. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. "I should have listened more. About the house. About Grandma. About you." The apology sounded genuine because it was incomplete. Real regret never arrives polished. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly beside the kitchen counter. "So now I am the villain because I wanted us to move forward?" she asked sharply. "Nobody said that," Daniel answered quietly. "You sold something that was never yours to decide about." Her expression hardened instantly. "It was a piano." "No," I said softly. Both of them looked at me. I rested one hand gently against the keys before continuing. It was proof that this family existed long before convenience became more important than memory. The room fell silent again. Then slowly I sat down on the bench and lifted the piano lid carefully. The ivory keys felt cool beneath my fingers, familiar in the way childhood homes remain familiar even after decades pass. For a moment, I simply sat there remembering my mother's hands beside mine all those years ago. Then quietly, I began playing the unfinished composition she left inside the hidden compartment. The notes moved slowly through the living room, soft and aching and beautiful in ways words could never fully explain. Daniel sat down heavily in the armchair near the window with tears shining silently in his eyes. Vanessa remained standing perfectly still near the kitchen, but for once she had nothing left to say. And as the final notes drifted through the house my mother once fought so hard to preserve, I realized something unexpected. The piano had never truly been what she was protecting. She was protecting the part of us still capable of remembering who we were before greed taught us to forget.